Some of you are on the brink of retirement, while others are already living it. Retirement opens the door to new possibilities, allowing people to explore passions, revisit old hobbies, and reflect on a lifetime of work. Architecture advocate and enthusiast Steven Englehart has lived in the North Country most of his life, and he's been retired for 4 years. He was the executive director of Adirondack Architectural Heritage, or AARCH, for 27 years. And now, as a retired person, he has time to do other things, such as have a chat with us today. Thank you so much for coming in.
Great to be here, Paul.
Before we talk about your life in retirement, let's talk briefly about what you did for a living. What is the mission of Adirondack Architectural Heritage?
Well, Adirondack Architectural Heritage is a private nonprofit organization that is dedicated to furthering historic preservation activity and all around the Adirondack region through technical assistance and education and advocacy and a lot of and partnering with other organizations to make good things happen. The big successes of my time at AARCH were saving Camp Santanoni, a great camp in the town of Newcomb, from decades of neglect by New York State, getting the state to dedicate itself to its preservation, raising money to do millions of dollars of rehabilitation work there, staffing it in the summer, and making it a place that tens of thousands of New Yorkers and others come and enjoy every year. Another thing I'm particularly proud of is that we were very involved in, again, getting New York State to change a policy around the fire towers that existed on a lot of Adirondack mountains. And their intention in the 90s was to tear almost all of these down. And we saw that people had a tremendous affection for these fire towers. And there was and we tapped into a kind of groundswell of interest in their preservation. And we got them listed on the National Register. We created some friends organizations so that people could adopt them, raise money, rehabilitate them, open them to the public, and use them for public enjoyment. And
so you have many high-profile successes in your career. As retirement was approaching, and you knew you were going to leave that routine, did that intimidate you at all?
I'm one of these people that looked forward to going to work every day. I had just an incredible job. I was running an organization with an incredible mission, an excellent board of directors, an excellent staff, and I was connected to dozens and dozens of communities throughout the Adirondack region doing an incredible variety of work. And so I absolutely loved my work. But I've also had lots of things that I was interested in doing, including, I should say, deciding to do a big renovation project on my house, of which I did about 90% of it myself. So I had this building project in the first year that I was retired. It took me about 4 months. It gave me great satisfaction. It really added a lot to this lovely little historic house that I live in Essex. And that was a great way to transition from full-time work to juggling and cultivating these other things in my life.
Did your love of architecture help you with renovating your own house?
Well, I've always done a lot of my own work on historic buildings that I owned, whether they were in Keysville or in Essex. I've always loved working with my hands. I built a house for myself at age 20 out of stone. And so I've always liked building. I mean, it's one of the reasons I got into the architecture field. I love working with my hands, and so all of that came very naturally. I already knew how to work with hammers and chisels and build things out of stone, but my interest in retirement was maybe I could do some carving, some sculpture, and learn to carve stone. And so that was something new for me that was grounded in, my experiences when I was in my 20s.
And what kind of sculptures are you making now?
The kinds of things that I've created, I would say, are mostly abstract, but I did create a piece over the last year that is not abstract, and it was the first piece that I did that I felt was good enough to be worthy of putting in an exhibition, which is something I've done. When I was visiting a museum in Montreal recently, I saw an Inuit piece that really captured my attention. And that was a simple piece of a man fishing through the ice. And you could see the man above on the ice surface, and you could see the fish down below. And I thought in this little piece that was about this big, it said so much about the simple process of catching food, the daily elemental process of catching food. And I thought, I looked at it and I said, what are the kinds of things that are part of my world, my life, like that I could carve? And I thought, well, in Lake Champlain, we do ice fishing. And so I did a piece called Fish Dreams, which is quite a bit bigger than the Inuit piece that I just described. And there's a man sitting on the flat top of the piece, and and he's got a pole, and a line goes down through a hole. And then in the open cavity inside the piece are these two big fish swimming by, and the man is made out of black marble, and the fish are made out of black marble, and the box that represents the lake and the ice is all made out of white marble. And it's a really, I think it says a lot about life here in the North Country. It was inspired by this Inuit piece that I loved, and it's the first piece I've done that I'm really happy with. And I put it in a show in West Rutland. I put it in another show here in Plattsburgh, and it was nice to get it out in the world. So it made me, really excited about, beginning to see my work as being, worthy of putting out in public.
And you're getting out there in other ways as well as a performer.
So before I retired, I had already started to carve stone. But I think the biggest surprise of retirement was the degree to which I've gotten back into playing music. And I've always loved to play music. I played in a rock and roll band in high school. I was inspired by Pete Seeger to learn how to play the 5-string banjo, and so I learned a lot of folk music in addition to the rock and roll that I was playing. But it was really in having the time in retirement and finding some people to play with that my ability and my interest in playing music has really blossomed.
Roll down, buddy, don't roll so slow. How can I roll when the wind's so low?
And this has been incredibly exciting. I feel like I'm a bit like returning to stonework. This is returning to some earlier roots around playing music that really is, it's so beautiful and joyful, and it just brings me incredible pleasure, week after week after week.
And in addition to all that you're doing with your arts, I understand you're helping make the world a better place in other ways.
Paul, one of the things I learned from my parents is the importance of doing volunteer work in one's community, and they were very involved in that as growing up in Plattsburgh, and so I've done that for a lot of my life, and now so it continues to be a big part of my life now. I'm on the board of directors of the Waylandsburg Grange, which is an organization that brings all kinds of life, music, and lectures, and dinners, and theater and movies to the Grange Hall in Waylandsburg. I'm on the board of directors of the Carving Studio and Sculpture Center, where I took carving lessons, and I'm helping bring my nonprofit management experience to trying to make that an even better organization. All of that has been incredibly rewarding work, and so I think if I could sort of pull all of these things together about, for me, what makes the sort of healthiest retirement, it's doing things that are good for your, at the soul level, the creative work. It's making sure that that you've got community involvements. It's making sure that you've got people in your life who love you and that you love. And so you've got creativity and love and community involvement, and at least for me, that's the magic.
Well, Steven, it's been absolutely delightful speaking with you today, and you're taking the mystery out of retiring, which a lot of people find very helpful. So thank you so much.
My pleasure, Paul.